Bienvenidos. Today we're going to talk about an essential part of learning to speak Spanish, verbal exposure. If you want to learn how to speak Spanish, you have to get exposure to the Spanish language. So I want you to be able to make informed choices when you're considering all of the resources that are available to you to get verbal exposure. But the first thing I want to do is talk about some aspects of verbal exposure and then talk about the resources that are available. So first off, I want to talk to you about two aspects of verbal exposure. So we say it's verbal exposure because what we're doing is trying to get listening experience to Spanish. So we want to get mental sound images in our mind about what Spanish is supposed to sound like. And the way we do that is by imitating what we hear. And that's how we're going to learn to speak Spanish, because that's how we learn our first language and that's how we're going to learn other languages. So it involves the auditory sense, the listening sense. The other thing about verbal exposure that people don't think about is that it also involves visual exposure, because we imitate not only what we hear but what we see, and that's how we learned our first language. And that's how we're going to learn Spanish also. So it's not only important to get that verbal exposure, the auditory part, but also visual exposure of the Spanish language being used. Brain research today is exploring these mirror neurons, which are actually neurons in our brain. Their specialty is to help us repeat actions that we see. So there are two really important senses that we need to be aware of when we're talking about exposure to Spanish. There's an auditory component and also a visual component. And as we know, the more senses that we can involve when we're learning, the more we're going to remember and the easier it's going to be for us to latch on to that new information. So we want to try to involve those two senses, the visual and auditory, when we're talking about getting exposure to Spanish. Now the other thing that we have to take into consideration is our own personal circumstances, because language is a very personal thing. And we want to make sure that this is the language that belongs to us. So we have to take into consideration our own personal attributes. We have to take into consideration our interests. When we're looking at resources, we want to think about, does this interest me? Because if it's high interest, or if it interests us at all, that's going to involve our emotions. That's going to help us remember the information better. So we have to take into consideration interests. We also have to take into consideration our personal abilities, things that we're good at, and especially things that maybe we're not so good at, because we want to use our time and resources to the maximum. So we want to get the best amount of exposure that we can, and we want to look at using exposure in a way that caters to our abilities. There's another video called How to Learn Spanish Vocabulary, and that talks a lot about finding out what kind of abilities you might have. So if you want to explore that topic more, check out the How to Learn Spanish Vocabulary video. Now also you want to take into consideration accessibility. That just means what's available to you. What can you actually do? You might be restricted financially, you might be restricted, physically or time-wise. So, resources are out there, but they may just not be accessible to you readily enough. And maybe it's not, maybe sometimes they're available, sometimes not. So you'll have to use a lot of different resources to get exposure, and that's a good thing. Okay, so now we can talk about the aspects of resources. There are a lot of things to take into consideration when we're looking at resources. And we want to know this before we start spending a lot of time on a particular resource. We want to know what we're getting out of that resource. So are we getting a lot of sensual experiences? Are we getting kinesthetic, which is your three-dimensional, tactile sense? Are we getting visual? Are we getting auditory? We want to make sure that we're getting as much as we can. Are we getting enough time? Are we getting it often enough? And are we getting the repetition at the beginning level that we want, so that we can hear kind of the same voices and phrases over and over? Are we getting native language exposure? If you have a person who is trying to help you learn Spanish or speaking Spanish with you often, and they don't have a native or near native accent, this might not be the exposure that you're looking for. If you're in a classroom with people and every day you're hearing a bunch of people speak Spanish who don't have a good accent, that's kind of negative exposure. You want to get native or near native language exposure. So make sure that that's the type of exposure that you're striving for. The content of what you're actually hearing is important. Is it authentic communication? Is it real communication? Or is it reproduced, like in a movie where actors are acting things out? Or is it totally fictional, like, storybook characters or cartoon characters? Is it complicated? What level are you at and what level are you looking for? We're looking for authentic communication, but it could be, a different complexity level depending on what you're looking for. Purpose, is it interpersonal communication? Because that's what we want to be able to do. We want to be able to communicate interpersonally with other people in Spanish. Or are we mostly getting experiences in a presentational format where people are speaking to us, entertaining us, or informing us? Because we want to be sure that we're getting interpersonal exposure as much as possible. That's our goal. Any exposure is good, but we just want to be aware of all these characteristics of different resources. So when you're choosing your resources, you're just aware of the different types of things that are important that go into getting good exposure to help you learn Spanish. So let's look at some resources now. The first resource I want to talk about briefly is Immersion. There's another video about study abroad and immersive experiences, so I'm not going to cover this in depth, but you have to be aware that immersion is a great experience. So immersive experiences, they can give us, all of the senses because it's kinesthetic, auditory, and visual. It's three-dimensional. They can or maybe not give us the time that we want. That's going to depend on the experience. And we want to make sure that we're getting that native exposure when we have immersive experiences. We want to be sure that we are getting authentic communication. Usually immersive experiences are authentic. Complexity is usually advanced with immersive experiences, and you want to make sure when you're doing an immersive experience that it's interpersonal communication, because it could just be presentational. So you want to check into that when you're considering an immersive experience. Again, there's another video about study abroad and immersive experiences. Immersive experiences are one of the best experiences, but a lot of times they're not available to everybody. So I just want to cover that briefly, and it's covered in another video. Now, the next area that I want to talk about is exciting because these resources are available to just about everybody, and because of technology, we can have Spanish in our hands on our little laptops. So we can watch movies, we can watch our favorite movie or favorite DVD over and over again with the Spanish track. We can watch YouTube videos, we can do Skype, we can watch music videos, we can watch TV shows in Spanish just at our fingertips. And if we look at this, we are getting both of those critical components. We're getting visual and auditory exposure, so this is great. Time is going to depend on the resource that you're using and how much time you spend. Repetition, you want to be sure that at the beginning level you're watching the same video over and over, or the same DVD. If you're watching TV programs, watch the same series if you can. If you're watching a telenovela, a little soap opera in Spanish, watch it so the same telenovela every day, so that you're getting the same characters and the same voices at the beginning level. Now, if you're at the advanced level, you want to try to get variety. Let's see, native, you're going to get native speaker exposure, which is great. You can get all the content in all the different complexity levels and all the different reality levels that you can get. You can get all the purpose levels, you can get interpersonal, you can get presentational. So these resources are just awesome. And it's just great that these are available to you, so take advantage of those. Now, radio and music I want to talk about too, because radio, especially in music, might be readily available to you more than these others. If you spend a lot of time in your car, or if you spend a lot of time in a place where you're listening to music, then this might be a great resource for you to use. Even though there's not a visual component, okay, it's just auditory, it's still exposure. So get as much exposure as you can. Use a lot of these different resources. So auditory is good. You know, the amount of time you spend is going to depend on you. Again, if you spend a lot of time in your car and there are radio stations or you have music available, you know, take advantage of that. You're bored anyway, so just take advantage of it. Native, you know, clearly you can get native exposure there to native accent. It's authentic. It's usually advanced though, so just if you're getting that kind of exposure and you're at the beginning level, that's good. Just be patient. You know, it's gonna come eventually, so just be patient. And with the radio, you're gonna get all types of communication, but with the music, it's mostly to entertain. But the radio, you could get interpersonal, where you have DJs talking to each other or people calling in. You can get the presentational, so you can get with radio all, but with the music, the downloaded music, you're just going to get the entertaining aspect of it. With the visual technology available to you, you want to make sure that you're not looking at subtitles. So if you're watching music videos, or if you're watching DVDs or even YouTube videos that have subtitles, turn those off. And if you can't turn them off, then don't use them, because we're looking for an auditory experience, and when we say visual, we're talking about images. So don't use text as part of this experience, because it's going to throw off your listening. Your brain's going to shut off the listening and start reading when you look at the text. So we're looking for a listening experience. So if you're reading text and trying to get a listening experience, it's not going to happen, except for this next category that I'm going to talk with you about. Some people don't really think about text as a way to get language experience, but it can be if you're using it in an informed way. Now, there are a lot of text available to us in Spanish. We have books, we have web pages, we have literature, brochures and flyers and advertisements. We have periodicals, magazines, newspapers that might be readily available to us and usually are available on our computer. The thing about text is, if you are at the beginning level, the only way text is going to be a good listening experience for you is if someone who is a native speaker or near native is speaking and reading that text to you, because you're still at a point where you're trying to develop that good accent. Now, it's good for you to practice reading aloud and practice getting that accent. But if you're looking for actual auditory exposure, you also at the beginning level need to get lots of exposure to native accents, so you know what you're striving for when you're doing the text. Now, at the more intermediate and advanced level, if you have that solid accent and you have that solid pronunciation, then reading text aloud can be a great way for you to get verbal exposure. It can also be a great way at the beginning level, as long as you're listening to someone with a native or near native accent. So with text, the delivery is questionable. You know, you may not even get the auditory experience right, so you have to check into that. The time, again, is going to depend on you. The origin, questionable. You know, you just need to make sure you're getting that native sound or near native sound when you're listening. The great thing about text, though, is the content can be everything. It can be any type of reality that you're looking for, and it can be any level, because there's so many children's books. You know, if you're at the beginning level, there are a lot of online children's books that are read aloud to you. It can have that visual component, you know, and some of them even have little videos in them. So the nice thing about text is it's available. You know, you can get it at any level, and it's usually presentational though, so you're not getting a lot of interpersonal. But you know, text can be a good resource to use. You just have to be informed about how you're using it. So please be informed when you're spending your time and effort getting exposure to Spanish, and just get as much exposure as you can with the best resources that you can find, and you'll be able to become fluent in Spanish without having to travel abroad.